When should nations go to war? This was the question in the 1930s and 40s was addressed by many nations. There were two major causes of the Second World War: a rise of dictators and the free world's responses to such men. Fascist dictators began to come to power worldwide, men such as Benito Mussolini, Francisco Franco, and Adolf Hitler. These men rose to lead their countries during the Great Depressions in the 1930s, promising to take them out of such an economic struggle. They did, generally, by making weapons of war. This should have been a good time to go to war, but no one stood up. The free world did four things in response to the new rising fascist threat. America became an isolationist nation. They decided they were not going to be involved in any foreign conflict. Meanwhile, in Europe, Britain and France were appeasing the Third Reich. They were ceding land and giving Hitler everything he wanted to avoid the repeat of the Great War. Later on, in 1941, Britain and America agreed if they won such a war, there would be free trade among all nations in the North Atlantic Charter. The fourth and most useful was President Roosevelt's response with the Lend-Lease policy, where the United States would lend Allied countries military supplies that would be returned after the war. Eventually, the U.S. did join the war, but only once it was too late. December 7, 1941. Most everything was locked, from ammunition to plate. Japan had been invading Manchuria and China in the past months, and the U.S. had placed an embargo. The Japanese felt this was a threat to their national security, and they wanted to send a message and clear out the Pacific Fleet so it could not hinder their plans. On that morning, 2 aircraft carriers were out at sea, so when the several planes appeared on the radar, it was no surprise. The consequent bombing of Pearl Harbor was tragedy that rallied Americans in support of the war. The American fleet was mostly salvaged and sent to the Pacific after the Japanese. There was a two-pronged attack, which was led by General MacArthur and Admiral Nimitz. Each would take one prong and hop from island to island towards Japan. For most of the four, they were defensive and were certainly not winning. However, after the Battle of Midway in 1943, the tide turned. After many years and the loss of many lives, the Japanese Empire surrendered.